Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Nicola Solomon, the Chief Executive of the Society of Authors. This is the fourth in our Autumn Afternoon Tea series and part of our second SOA at Home Festival. Our Autumn Winter Festival is a 9-week programme of events which runs until the 10th of December, and you'll be able to book the next ones from next week. Most of our events are free, but if you can afford to, please consider donating to the Authors Contingency Fund. We suggest a minimum donation of £5. There's a link to it in the chat, and it will support authors in financial difficulties due to the health crisis. You can also help by browsing our virtual Blackwell store, featuring books by the authors and speakers, including Antonia and everyone else. And again, if you use the link, some money will go to the fund. We are very lucky, and I'm very excited to have Antonia Fraser as our guest this week. Today's intro, as usual, will be a quick intro from me, although not so quick because there's so much about Antonia we always want to say. And then we'll chat for about 30 minutes and then have about 15 minutes of questions. Thanks to anyone who sent in questions. But if you want to submit them during the session, please do so. Put them in the chat section and we'll get to them if we can. If you're having connection issues, which sometimes happens, just press the reconnect button, which usually works. So, Antonia. Hello. Antonia Fraser is the author of many widely acclaimed historical works, which have been international bestsellers. She was awarded the Medlicott Medal by the Historical Association in 2000, was made a Dame in 2011 for services to literature and a Companion of Honour in 2018. Her previous books include Mary Queen of Scots, King Charles II, The Week of Bessel, Woman's Lot in 17th-Century England, which won the Wolfson History Prize, Marie Antoinette, The Journey, Perilous Question, the drama The Great Reform Bill, 1832, and The King and the Catholics, The Fight for Rights, 1829. Must You Go, a memoir of her life with Harold Pinter, was published in 2010, and My History, a memoir of growing up, in 2015. They are all great reads. I've actually been really enjoying revisiting them as preparation for this. And Antonia's still writing. The Case of the Married Woman, Caroline Norton, a 19th century heroine who wanted justice for women, will be published by Weidenfeld Nicolson on 6th of May 2021. So that's a great one to look forward to. Antonia, as well, is a huge supporter and always has been of the Society of Authors. She's been a member for over 50 years. She was the chair of the management committee in 1975, when she was hugely involved in the campaign for public lending right. She's on our council. She co-founded the Authors Foundation and has endowed 2 Authors Foundation awards for historical biography, as well as being closely involved with the Elizabeth Longford Prize for historical biography. So, you know, it's very wonderful to have with us someone who is so connected with the Society of Authors and has been for such a long time and has always been hugely supportive to me as well. Antonia, can you just start by giving us a short tour of your workspace and your creative routine? Where are you geographically? Who are you with?
I live near Notting Hill Gate in Camden Hill Square. When it was built, it was called Notting Hill Square, and then the residents, a snobby lot, thought that Notting Hill was beneath them, and they changed it to Camden Hill Square. And it is said that when the great film Notting Hill came out, wanted to change it back, but I think that's a myth. Anyway, but I have actually lived here for 61 years, and that means that I've seen tremendous changes. And also I'm very sort of rooted in it, you know. I've actually born 2 of my 6 children in this house, so wow. It's very much part of my life. And having bought it at a time when the houses were very cheap, the houses in our square were still bombed from the war, not rebuilt, I was terribly lucky.
So huge changes in that area over that time. I lived in Notting Hill in about the 80s, when it was really not a place you necessarily wanted to live. And we talked about, you're not in the room you write in at the moment, and you said that you don't feel comfortable in showing people around, but you're going to talk about why it's special to you to have a special writing.
Why I don't
Why you don't want to show us round your writing space.
Well, I'd love to talk about it, but I will
which I'd love to hear.
I explain exactly why, quite frankly. I'm the oldest of 8 children, born in 15 years, and the mother of 6, some years later. And for me, writing was my private thing. It wasn't a family thing. Neither of my parents were writers. My mother went on to be a very distinguished writer, but she wasn't. She was a politician, stood for Parliament twice. My father was a politician. And so it became my private thing where I got away from everybody and went to my little home, And when I got married and started to have my 6 children, it became even more so my little home, except at first the only little home I could find was in the corner of my bedroom. And then a wonderful day came, or was it sort of 20, 30 years later, and I noticed the last child had finally pushed off. And I moved into the nursery, which is at the top of the house, and made it mine. And one of my sons called it my Eyrie, E-Y-M-R-I-E, and it's known as the Eyrie ever since. And I think my children, some of whom are in their 60s, still rather resent me being in their nursery. That is a great-grandmother.
And that sort of ties back, because in my history, you talk about how when you moved with your parents, you were given a tiny attic room in Oxford, and how important that was as the oldest of 8 to have a room of your own, and how your brother still rather resented that yours was slightly bigger than his.
It's absolutely true. I had this tiny room. That was the very first one. That's when I got my passion for a room of my own. And years later, we lived next to the Dragon School. One of the governors, who I think they now owned or did own the house, took us round, and Thomas was still complaining that his room had been less grand than my room. They were both absolutely minute. So I have this, I tell you, I have this private feeling about my working space, but I write completely for my readers. I'm not writing for myself, I'm writing for my readers. So the moment the book's completed and publishing, then I love all contact with readers. I mean, I love readers' letters, and I like to think I've answered all of them. I won't say by return, but I've answered all of them, except any overtly hostile ones, of which I've had very few indeed, but I wouldn't answer them. But normally I answer them because I love it. I want to.
That's so lovely. It's a kind of communication. And while you're actually writing, as well as needing your room, are there any particular things you need? You need to write with a certain pen? Do you have certain rituals that you need in order to write?
I love having the window absolutely wide open. I mean, my Eyrie is obviously at the top of the house. I like a huge, wide, even in the worst of weathers, I like fresh air. I think it's sort of inspiring me somehow. And another thing about the privacy, I used to work when my children went to creche, pram, kindergarten, school, and then write like a bat out of hell until they came back at lunchtime. And they say, and I deny this, that I had a notice on my door saying, only come in if you've broken a leg. I deny.
So does that mean that you write in those, do you still write in those particular hours? Or do you, because presumably you only had very limited hours in order to.
During lockdown, I extended, if you remember, the early weather was terribly good. And I was writing my current book, which will come out in May. And for the first time, I had absolutely nothing else to do. And I wrote all the morning, and then afternoon doing a Captain Tom walking around my garden, and then I went back to writing. But normally, if I'm not working in the morning, I feel rather guilty. It's so ingrained in me.
Yes.
And I mean, Harold, my late husband, Harold Pinter, and I, we were Jack Sprat and his wife, because he didn't sort of write in the morning and left to himself, which he wasn't. He would get up late. But then he might, if he was in the grip of an image, he might write all night. I once tried writing most of the night when I was writing about, I think, the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, with the tears dripping down my cheeks. And in the morning, I got up and read it. It was piffle. I had to start again.
So you never got to see each other because you're all working at different times.
I know that sounds a bit odd. We managed once or twice.
And you've talked a bit about the book you're working on at the moment. How did you manage research, or had you done all the research before lockdown?
I was incredibly lucky. I really was born under a lucky star, because I just finished all the research for going to the libraries, which I incidentally enjoy very much, primary sources. And I had the structure, which is very important to me. I'd done that. And the only thing I had to do was write. Also, I mean, we do live, from that point of view, in good times. If I wanted a primary source, a document from Dorset archives, you can email them and they'll send you a copy. So things are much better in that way.
And I know that, absolutely, but I know that for you, seeing the places, if you can, is really important. You talk about measuring the face of Mary Queen of Scots, for example. Somehow that physical contact is important, isn't it?
I call it optical research. That's for tax purposes, but it's absolutely genuine and it's inspirational. And, I mean, when I was doing Cromwell, my first husband had fought throughout the war, so he was tremendously helpful. We went all around the battlefields. The only trouble was that he was good at military matters, as he should have been, and I wasn't. And I was inclined to say, this is what he did, and, he came from the north and he did this and that, the other. Then I turned the map round and realised actually came from the south. I had to say, excuse me. But still, I love doing it. I mean, you can't write about Marston Moor unless you've been to Marston Moor.
And do you want to tell us a bit about this current book that's coming out?
Well, I'll tell you a little bit about it, because obviously I'm very passionate about it, as one is. It's called The Case of the Married Woman, Caroline Norton, a 19th century heroine who wanted justice for women. And in very, very short, in 1836, her husband, George Norton, sued the then Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, for adultery with his wife. They were found innocent. Whether they were or not, read my book and find out. Then legally, I repeat, legally, he chucked her out of the house. Legally, this is the most terrible thing, kept her from seeing their 3 children under 7, one of whom subsequently died of an injury which wasn't intended, and legally lived off the money of the copyright of her works because she was a writer. So what did she do? I would have collapsed under that. She campaigned, and the Infant Custody Bill Act owed a lot to her inspiration and activity, which had the revolutionary idea, which will shock everyone, that a mother has the right to access to her own children.
Oh, it sounds
so good for Caroline Norton.
It sounds absolutely fascinating. I will definitely make sure I look out for that. And how do you choose who you write about? I know that Mary Queen of Scots was a passion for you long before you wrote that book, and it wasn't your first book, was it? But it was the one that you wanted to write.
I had written 2 children's books when I was 21 and 22, which was published in something called Heirloom Library, which was sold by Marks and Spencer, because my employer, I worked for a publisher after Oxford, had this series for classics. And when they were asked for King Arthur, and there is no classic King Arthur except Malory, and you couldn't ask children to read Malory, and T.H. White was in copyright. And George Weidenfeld, who was a magnificent man, just pointed at me and said, "You, Antonia, will write it." So I wrote my first book, King Arthur. And I wrote 2 of them, and then 2 books about antique toys, history of toys and dolls. And then one day my mother came round to see my children, who were enacting Bubba and Celeste or whatever. and she'd had her very successful Queen Victoria and was looking for another subject. And she said, oh, by the way, quite casually, my agent has suggested doing Mary Queen of Scots. And Nicola, I froze with horror. Then I went into pulsing rage and said, you can't, she's my Mary Queen of Scots. My mother was, not at all phased, said, oh, well, I'll probably do the Duke of Wellington, she said, in a sort of sophisticated way. And I'd always wanted to do it, but that just spurred me. And that was the beginning of my very happy life.
And how have you chosen subjects since then?
Many different ways. I mean, the 6 Wives of Henry VIII, my American...
A beautiful illustrated edition behind me here.
Yes, isn't it lovely?
Lovely.
My American editor and friend, Bob Gottlieb, I said, I'm looking for a subject. I was in America, not on a book tour. And he said, well, this is going to sound a stupid idea, but have you thought of doing the 6 Wives of Henry VIII? And I said, that's not a stupid idea, Bob. It's an idea of genius. And I did it. And I loved doing it. I mean, this is before many other excellent books had been done.
It's a wonderful book. And you manage to keep the personalities so separate. And you have a real talent for that. And I find that amazing, because one thing that I know you are extremely rigorous about is the importance that history must be based on research. You can't infer anything.
Oh no, I'm not a historical novelist. I respect the art, but it's not mine. And although I read them as a child, I used to read Margaret Owen. I can't read them now, not out of lack of respect, but it's just, I would be such a pain. I would be thinking, where does that come from? And that's not right. So I think the important thing to realize, it's a completely separate art, historical fiction. It is an art, but it's a separate one.
Yes, and I know you say you would never write that someone swept across a room unless you had proof that she swept across that room. And I think that's tremendously, it comes across in your work, and yet what also comes across is a great feeling that you've somehow got inside the heads of the people you write about. So it's not dry either.
But you see, Nicola, one of my mantras is to look in the mirror and say, on the one hand, Mary Queen of Scots is exactly like me. She's a woman, she's tall, she's very tall, she loves her child, she has pride, jealousy, envy, lazy, clever, and all that. On the other hand, she's totally unlike me, because she became a queen at 6 days old when her father died. I so far have not become a queen. And I could, and it's in the difference between those two and the uniting of them, because she also had all those emotions, that I think the art of historical biography lies.
And you do it so wonderfully. But you have written other books. You wrote a few detective novels. Was that
8,
very
yes.
different? Yeah.
Well, that began because Harold and I used to do a lot of traveling for his directing and for his plays. And I like to work. I enjoy work. And in a hotel, in an American hotel, you can't research books. And so I started to write detective stories featuring Jemima Shaw. And I had a very good time. I wrote them at the same time. But, they're not kind of connected. But I love reading detective stories. I always have. I mean, Dorothy Sayers is one of my heroines. Agatha Christie was a terrific heroine. So in a way, it was, although I did it with a full heart, it was a sort of sideline,
And then you've also written these 2 really frank and beautiful memoirs, and must have been quite painful. Were you happy to bare your soul in public? You talk about how you write for your readers, and yet you're talking about very full, very fascinating life, but did that feel comfortable for you?
Well, they were very different because I'm sorry, the sun is Pascal. If you put out give me the white Mars ball. Sorry.
Oh, it's so light. Yes.
What happens with these things? No, they were very different because Must You Go, a month after Harold died in January 2009, I was having lunch with an old friend, sort of lovely condolence lunch, and he said, "Do you, just casually, Antonia, do you still keep a diary?" And at that moment, it came into my head immediately. And ungratefully, I leapt up and said, "Thank you so much for lunch. It's been tremendous fun." I rushed home and got out my diaries of the 33 years we were together, and I started to write it. And it was my morning. And how I would have been without, I don't know. But I poured all my morning into it. And I mean, obviously, painters pour morning into their painting, poets even more in their poetry. For me, there was this memoir.
It is the most beautiful book. If anyone hasn't read it, go out and buy it right now, even before we finish.
I can't read the end now. Isn't that? It's ridiculous. I can't read it. It's too sad. I could write it, but I couldn't read it.
It's fascinating.
But the other one was something I wanted to say about my discovery of history and to try to show people the importance of history and perhaps inspire a few children or boys or girls, but anyway, just to say what it had always meant to me and sort of weave it into my background.
And particularly fascinating is one of the things you say in that book is that history wasn't even taught as a separate subject. It was considered part of English. And I know that my husband also had this kind of private education where really history and it was considered that a classical education was important and you didn't have to learn history at all. And yet it's so fantastically important to you.
It's so odd. I didn't remember history being taught at the excellent school I went to, the Dragon School. We lived next door. They had a few girls, mostly boys in those days. And I didn't remember history being taught as a subject, but I thought perhaps I'm imagining it. And then I found my old school reports my mother had kept, and there is no printed section called history. I mean, this is a long time ago. I'm sure there is now.
Would hope so.
Yeah.
I'm going to move on a bit to wider feelings about the world. Partly about how difficult has it been for you during lockdown to keep inspired and connected. It must be particularly hard because you do have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and more than the rule of 6 if they're all together. So how's it all been?
That's quite true. But in actual hard lockdown, there wasn't even the rule of 6. But I'm very lucky. I've got a garden, and my garden has a door to the next street, so that somebody, could visit me with food, a picnic or something, and go through the garden and sit on the terrace, not come inside the house. I mean, we never broke the rules without going through my house. And that was very lucky. And the weather being good was very lucky. I felt really sorry for people who didn't have even a balcony. I think that was tough.
Yes, and I suppose that leads me on to it, because it's completely true that people have been affected very differently through the crisis, and it's very unfair and unequal. And your parents particularly were passionate about social justice. I wonder how they would have felt about all of this and the demonisation of the young and so on.
Yes, I that's an interesting thought. My mother would have kept the rules absolutely and been pretty sharp with anyone who didn't. My father, I think, would have ignored them, whether through, I think through genuine sort of vagueness and indifference. I mean, he was someone who was capable of taking a taxi from one side of the road to the other, whereas my mother, as far as I remember, never took a taxi at all. And no, I don't want to blacken his memory. He wouldn't have meant to break the rule, but he'd been a bit vague, I think.
And do you have thoughts, both for the publishing industry and others, about what will come out of this crisis? Is there anything good, or is it all difficult? We know it's tremendously difficult for many of our members who can't perform, who are suffering financially, and indeed the things that Harold would have been passionate about, like the theatre being closed and so on. Do you have any thoughts about it?
Yes, I think I completely understand that. I mean, a facile answer would be an awful lot of books will come out of it, and that's also true. You know, people will. My publisher told me that people are fulfilling their contracts, you know, and things like that. As against that is exactly what you said, particularly because I'm connected to the world of the theatre. I think the suffering of everybody to do with the theatre, designers, stagehands, you know, their livelihoods just vanished. And I think it's tragic. I mean, I hope very much that the beloved theatre, which is one of the glories of Britain, I think, I hope it sort of struggles back and then is back. I mean, Harold's play, Betrayal, opened last night at the Theatre Royal Bath. I mean, heavily socially isolated, obviously keeping all the rules, but that was an act of courage by the Theatre Royal.
That's wonderful, and it's wonderful to hear that happening, and hopefully people will support, because I think we all have a lack of confidence, so people are doing even less than they're allowed to do in some way.
Yes, I agree. I mean, they want to get on with their lives. They don't want to break the rules. But I think when we think of someone connected to the government who did break the rules, I think good people find it very irritating.
To say the least, I think, yeah. And I'm aware that I'm almost running out of my time for asking questions. So I do want to ask a bit about the Society of Authors. You've been a great supporter of us. And in terms of creating work, you helped set up the Authors Foundation and been a trustee till very recently. What have you learned from that process of helping people with buying time to write and the importance of it? You learned?
Well, we set it up, Michael Holroyd and I, in 1984, but it was the idea, I should say, of Mark Leffenwho, really. So he must be given all credit for the inspiration. And I'm immensely proud of it, as I'm sure you are, because and we co-judged it alternate years for a long time. Well, I learned how very little authors get by on. Quite shocking. Distinguished authors paid very, very little. And then the other thing I learned as the years passed, I repeat, began in 1984, I learned how authors' advances, if anything, go down rather than going up with inflation. And that upsets me very much. And I like the way the Authors Foundation, it's very much for people who are writers. It's not for someone who sits up in bed and said, I like to be a writer. It's for writers who are part of the profession. And I think we have helped people. I mean, we've had wonderful, as you know, wonderful, grateful letters. And I think we should, people should. And when I resigned as a trustee, I founded a little award for people who write about a woman or women. It's to do with historical biography, but could be a composite one. And in the few years that has taken place, I've had marvellous letters from people, and good for the Authors Foundation, I think.
Well, it's a wonderful, your award is wonderful, and the Authors Foundation does. We're giving out £330,000 a year now, thanks to the Royal Literary Fund and others, and it's just fantastic for helping people write. But that leads me on, because you mentioned historical biography then, you're also a judge and founder of the Elizabeth Longford Prize for Historical Biography, which was endowed in honour of your mother. And
by my daughter, Flora.
By your daughter, but you've been very involved with it. And again, another wonderful prize for supporting historical biography with some great winners.
It's been very interesting. My daughter, with the help of her partner, Peter Soros, founded after my mother died at the age of 96 in 2002. So next year will be the 20th anniversary. And the idea was not to give it to literary biography. Nothing wrong with literary biography. There are great literary biographies, but to give it to historical biography. And the result is that the panel, the 5 judges, have very interesting discussions about what is a historical biography. I chaired it for 7 years, and it's now chaired by Roy Foster, distinguished professor of Irish history. And we have really good times. It's an honour to judge it.
That's fantastic. And just before I go on to get you to do a reading, so much of the threads of what you say about the importance of championing women and what women do, and many of the books are dealing with particular issues that, because having women and having children, or the lives of women and the power of women. And how do you feel? Would you class yourself a feminist? And is that something you've done consciously or unconsciously throughout?
Well, I once said publicly, because people occasionally remind me, every intelligent woman must be a feminist. But it wasn't, it's true, but it wasn't serious. I would rather say that I believe in the equality of all people, which I do. And as a Catholic, not a particularly good Catholic, but as a Catholic, isn't that what God is supposed to do? Believe in love all people equally. So I believe in equality, which means, of course, in practical terms, you do become something like a feminist. I also, if you believe women are equal with men, you must believe men are equal with women. I would like to see the fight between the two, the notional fight, vanish in favour of helping the underprivileged and the oppressed, whether many of whom are women, but many of whom, are also men. But I do, obviously, I've written a lot about women's history, and with great interest. When I wrote The Weaker Vessel, which is about English women in 17th century, all the great works of history of the 17th century, and there are many great works, none of them had the word women in their index. Wasn't that strange?
Amazing.
That book was published in 1984. So I'm talking about books in the 70s and earlier.
Let's hope it's changed slightly. Now, I'd love to get you to do a reading for us, and I think you're going to read from Mary Queen of Scots for us.
I am. I have to change my spectacles. I'm sure I'm not the only member of the Society of Authors.
We all know that one.
I'm going to read from the end of Mary Queen of Scots, when Mary's body has been moved from Peterborough Cathedral to Westminster Abbey by her son, James I. She was found, when they looked at her tomb, to be surrounded by other Stuart princes and princesses, many of them children. So the Queen of Scots found peace at last. There can be little doubt that Mary, who cared so much and so prolongedly for the English succession, would have been satisfied at the last with her burial place in Westminster Abbey, among the kings and queens of England. Her rights as a queen, to which she attached such importance to the end, have thus been respected. Viewing that splendid edifice in marble, white in the darkness of the Henry VII Chapel, the last of the royal monuments, and the most imposing of them all, she would surely have felt that the cruelty of Elizabeth, in denying her the French burial she had craved, had been atoned for in an unlooked-for and glorious manner. Nor was the significance of her tomb entirely royal. A few years after this new interment, pious Catholics were spreading the news that holy benefits could be gained from a visit to the tomb as to a shrine. Dempster Bologna wrote in his History of the Scottish Church, published in 1627, I hear that her bones, lately translated to the burial place of the Kings of England at Westminster, are resplendent with miracles. As Mary's literary supporters developed the theme of the martyr queen, the White Tomb itself became a place of pilgrimage for the faithful. Meanwhile, in the opposite chapel, underneath the monument to Queen Elizabeth I, also raised by James, were found together in one grave the two daughters of Henry VIII, Mary Tudor and Elizabeth. Barren in life, they had been left to lie alone together in death. Mary, however, lies amid her Stuart posterity, her face locked in the marble of repose on the monument above, and her hands clasped in prayer, her body in the vault below, which harbours so many of her descendants. She, who never reigned in England, who was born a Queen of Scotland, and who died at the orders of an English queen, lies now in Westminster Abbey, where every sovereign of Britain since her death has been crowned. From her, every sovereign of Britain since her death has been directly descended, down to the present queen, who is the 13th generation. As Mary herself embroidered so long ago at Sheffield, on the royal cloth of state which was destined to hang over the head of a captive queen, "In my end is my beginning."
Beautiful.
And in her end was my beginning.
Of course. Yes, that's just wonderful. Now we've got time for a few questions, maybe not all the ones we've been sent in. And here's one that's been sent in from America, from Dorothy Zemach, who says, "I'm a huge fan of My Word. I still listen to reruns of YouTube every Saturday morning, as American radio stations sadly are no longer able to broadcast the show. Do you have a favourite or interesting memory about the show, or any snippet of insider information you could share with us?"
How lovely to think about My Word. Welcome to you. I enjoyed it so much. But what I enjoyed about it was the two people were such gentlemen. They were marvellous. And my partner, Frank Muir, was on the other side, but my partner, Dennis Norton, used to tell me the answer under his breath so that I would shine. And I thought that was, that was chivalry at its best. I think I enjoyed it all, really. Dilys Poe was the fourth person originally. And I was quite young at the time. She was quite old. But we were a very merry gang. So I don't have a particular memory, but I have a general memory of their chivalry and my enjoyment. Oh, one thing I will say, we had a little audience, even though it was radio. And I always took enormous trouble to have my hair done, so that the radio audience would appreciate me. And I remember my hairdresser saying, "Do you have a big audience?" I said, "Huge, hundreds and hundreds of people." And then I thought, actually, like Pinocchio, my nose would grow, because I suppose the most people who came to hear us live were 20 people. Anyway.
But you have to know that they're all out there imagining it. Mm. And Ali Sherrick asks, who is your favourite true life villain in history?
My favourite
true life villain.
My favourite true life villain?
Yes.
What an interesting question.
I thought so too.
I don't think I like villains, particularly not true life ones. They might come and get me. Perhaps we can choose someone who is more dashing than a villain. I'm trying to think. Well, perhaps I can choose Cromwell. I don't think he was a villain, but a lot of people thought he was a villain. So would that be all right?
You'd have to ask Ali, not me, but it's interesting. And of course, that again, a wonderful, wonderful book. And Lucinda Byatt asks, does each of your books have a different structure? And do you spend a lot of time working the structure out before you start writing?
Yes, that is absolutely to the point of my work. I spend about 3 months just structuring the book, because if you think about it, history just happens. I'm not making history happen. All I'm doing is shaping it for you. So I take a lot of trouble, and I'm very proud of my structures. And when I think a structure goes wrong, sometimes I think, oh, well, that'll do. And then whenever I read the book in print, I'm mortified and think that won't do. You know, you've got to stick to a proper structure.
And Victoria Gray says, which of your subjects would you most like to have dinner with? I mean, assuming they were still alive, I expect she means.
Yes, I would like to have dinner with the corpse. Well, there's no question. I would have liked to have dinner, and I repeat, dinner, nothing more. No late stay. I'd love to have had dinner with King Charles II, who I wrote about. The reason being that he liked women, quite apart from loving women, he also loved women, but he really liked them. And at the time, that was very unfashionable. People said, how can he actually like women? You know, women are only good for one thing, but he enjoyed their company. So I would go for having a lovely dinner with Charles II. And I wouldn't stay after dinner, promise.
Oh, you're very welcome, I'm
if
sure.
asked.
And how does that contrast with Louis XIV? I'm reading your wonderful Love and Louis XIV at the moment, and he also seemed to like women, but was a bit more, perhaps a bit more aware of himself as a king, perhaps.
Yes, I think he did like women, but I think he had an innate, because of the way he'd been brought up, he was orphaned. I mean, his father died when he was so young, and he'd been encouraged to be the little king by his mother, Anne of Austria. I think that he had a kind of, I mean, not unnatural for his time, but he had a kind of superiority to women, which Charles II, because of spending nearly 30 years roaming Europe and being helped by women, you know, in his various escapes, helped by women just as much as men, Charles II simply didn't have.
And Carlotta Eden asks, what's the best and most challenging thing about writing historical biographies?
The best and most challenging thing, is that two questions?
Oh, well, yes, you can answer it as two if you like.
I think the most challenging thing is to keep the narrative going and being fair to the narrative, not skipping over boring bits because I think they're boring, but maintaining them. And I think that's very difficult. I'm quite proud of the fact that I gave the right amount of space to Mary Queen of Scots' captivity, because after all, she was captive. She was a captive nearly half of her life. Sometimes people cut it short because it's not so historically interesting. And I think that's a real challenge.
And that must
another challenge. Sorry, no, just to finish, another challenge is to describe someone who obviously was regarded as beautiful in their own time, and yet you're going to have to show photographs of pictures that we don't see as beautiful. That's quite separate. I think that's difficult.
Yes, very interesting. And I was going to say, I suppose as well, that question about giving the time, it must be very difficult when there are periods of time which are extremely well researched and there's a lot of material about, and then when there are periods where there's almost nothing, to get the balance so that it feels like a life must be very difficult.
I think it is difficult. I mean, basically, if you don't like the heat, keep out of the kitchen. This is what we do. But I think it's very difficult not to cheat. I mean, I hope I never cheat, you know, to give it the proper weight. There's a passage in Kenneth Rose's life of King George V. Kenneth Rose was a friend of mine, and when he was writing George V, he said, what can I do? This man just went to Norfolk and collected stamps. I had no idea. I mean, I was very young at the time. And the wonderful passage came out. And so the slow years passed in a scholarly interest in philately, you know, it was sort of marvellous, but it was true.
And Steve Jones says, where do you draw the line on research? What point do you decide you've done enough research and now you've got to sit down and start writing?
I think that's a very good question. I think, oddly enough, it's when suddenly you're itching to give your view and you're fed up with reading other people's views, although you've derived enormous benefit from them. You're itching. You just think, I want to do this. And that, I think you get a signal, I must do it. Another signal is when you find you've researched the same book twice.
And you do a lot of research, you're really careful, and you said you love correspondence with people. People love picking up on mistakes. Have you ever been caught out in a mistake?
Oh, yes, everybody. I mean, you know, if you've not been caught out in a mistake, you know, what is it? If you've not, it's Kipling, if you've not met with triumph and disaster, met those two impostors just the same, you're not in my case, if you've not made a mistake, you're not a historian. In my memoir that you mentioned, my history, I describe how all my life I'd wanted to write about Mary Queen of Scots, and I called the last chapter, Reader, I Wrote It, referring, of course, to Jane Eyre, Reader, I Married Him. And somehow I said, I'm referring to Jane Eyre, of course, and the first chapter, which makes no sense at all. Of course, it's the last chapter. I mean, how could I, not only how could I have done that, how could people have let me get away with it? And when the book came, when it was first printed, I opened it full of joy. And when I got to that point, oh, I felt heartbroken. But the publisher very quickly corrected it.
And it is that horror, and that's then all you can see, isn't it?
Absolutely, it's all you can think about.
And I'm going to let you have a last word. Are there any words of inspiration or thoughtfulness that you would give to someone wanting to write historical biography? What would you say? What is it you most need to start with? Is it as in your case, a passion for a particular person, or is there something else?
I think a tremendous sense of enjoyment. This is going to be enjoyable. I think if you set about thinking this is going to be an arduous pilgrimage, you may not do so well. I think you've got to look forward to it and be rather thrilled, you know, and think, I'm going to be living with this person, even if they're Adolf Hitler, although I'd rather not.
That is so fascinating. I'm so sorry that we've run out of time, but we really do have to stop. So thank you so much, Antonia, for sharing with us. It's been really,
I loved it.
Really wonderful. Thank you so much.
It's really enjoyable.
I'm going to try this ejecting you from the room and then do our final bits and pieces. Thank you so much. And thank you to Sophia, who was our moderator. Thank you to everybody for listening in, which has been such fun. Just to remind you again that all our sessions are free, but if you can afford to donate a few pounds to the Authors Contingency Fund to support authors in difficulty, please do. And also that you can buy the books, including Antonia's from Blackwell's, and by buying the link we've put in here, you'll give some money to our contingency fund as well. Next week, we're taking a half-term break, and then we're going to resume with a really exciting programme in November. We're opening bookings for the next 3 weeks of the festival on Monday, the 26th of October, and the events will restart on the 2nd of November. And you'll be able to book from next week on our events page. And recordings from the festival are available at Vimeo. Again, there's a link here. And just huge thanks to everyone for joining us. And you can continue the conversation on Twitter, and the festival hashtag is @Society of Authors at Home. Thanks so much to everybody.